Knut Hamsun is one of the most renowned authors in Norwegian literature. He was praised for his groundbreaking modern style and nuanced depiction of characters. True greatness, however, seldom escapes controversy. Great figures are not immune to grave mistakes. Hamsun proves no exception to this rule. In 1940, he publicly supported the German Third Reich's occupation of Norway, having been awarded the Nobel Prize for his novel Growth of the Soil. He later handed his medal to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels as a gesture of support. He even had a personal audience with Adolf Hitler, but was fallen into the abyss of Nazism, inevitable for Hamsun. Let's find it out in this video essay. Before becoming Knut Hamsun, a literary icon, he was Knut Pedersen, a poor tailor's son. His education offered him few prospects. Over 6 years, he attended community school for just 252 days in total. Yet Hamsun was sharp-witted from the birth and devoured books in staggering quantities. Between ages 15 and 20, while working odd jobs, he produced a remarkable number of early novels, but these works brought him neither money nor fame. In 1882, Hamsun followed the dream of many Norwegians of his era. He sailed to the promised land, the United States of America. Though life as immigrant was harsh, the young writer devoted his spare time to lecturing on Norwegian literature. After 2 years in America, Hamsun fell seriously ill and returned to Norway, convinced he was doomed to die. The cause proved to be bronchitis. He would nevertheless make a second attempt in 1886, his final one. Those American years proved formative for Hamsun, but not for Knut Pedersen. The young writer discarded the old name, ascending toward literary immortality as Knut Hamsun. Knut Hamsun was 29 years old when the first part of his new novel was published in the New Yard. The publication proved a resounding success among critics. The complete novel Hunger, published in 1890, was a literary masterpiece. The book recounts the struggles and hardships of young writer craving acclaim while starving in Christiania, now Oslo, Norway's capital. Hamsun's book immerses readers in the feverish consciousness of his alter ego protagonist. With him, we embark on an odyssey through the veins of Norway's heart, stumbling upon people, objects, and wild thoughts of its hero. Hunger heralded the psychology-driven literature of the 20th century with its intricate character studies. Moreover, Hamsun's book was a stylistic experiment, one that prioritized the protagonist's inner world over external events. Decades before Ulysses and the Trial, it pioneered the unpunctuated stream of consciousness that Dame Joyce and Franz Kafka would later employ. Even André Breton, surrealism's founding father, recognized in Hunger a precursor to his theory of automatic writing. Following Hunger's critical breakthrough, Knut Hamsun cemented his success with a series of lectures in which he openly attacked his senior colleagues Henrik Ibsen, Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, Jonas Lie, and Alexander Kielland, the four literary giants of Norway's golden age. During the 1890s, he wrote 3 major works, Mysteries, Pan and Victoria, as well as several plays. After the death of his great literary predecessors at the turn of the 20th century, he was de facto recognized as Norway's leading writer. A spiritual yearning for the soil gradually crystallized in Hamsun's works that period. In Mysteries, in dialogue with beloved Martha, protagonist Nagel articulates this vision. They would go away, far away, God knows where, but they would steal off so that nobody knew what had become of them. That's what they would do, right? Then they would buy a little cottage and a plot of ground in the forest, a lovely forest someplace or other. It would be their very own, and they would call it Eden, and he would cultivate it. Or would he cultivate it? They had to have some cattle, a couple of large, sleek animals, which they would train to eat out of their hands, and while he dug and chopped and tilled the ground, she would tend the animals. Their fantasy of owning farmland stemmed from Hamsun's harsh experience of displacement in childhood. Born in Lam, central Norway, his family was forced to relocate to the remote northern province of Nordland. In his youth, he drifted from place to place, not only within the borders of his native land, but also in the USA. He was a plant torn from its soil. The novel Growth of the Soil stemmed from Hamsun's reflections on his rootless past. Published in 1917 at the height of World War I, this bucolic utopia offered a literary sanctuary, a true remedy to Europe's relentless bloodshed. The plot follows Isak, who settles in the Norwegian wilderness to establish a farmstead, Sellenro. He struggles through the hardships of rural life, marries a woman named Inga, and raises a family. While modern society exploits nature, Hamsun's characters don't fight the land, they become one with it. Hamsun conceived Growth of the Soil as a spiritual manifesto for the Norwegian people against the temptation of modernity. In a 1918 letter to a friend, he confessed, "Had I but a little more health, I would again take a plot of virgin land and set to work, transforming it into tilled fields and meadows, planting forests and raising livestock." He was resolved to incarnate utopia. Before long, Hamsun purchased Norholm, a manor house in Grimstad. This former noble estate became his laboratory for recreating a dream, simple rural life in perfect harmony with nature. For the first time, he put down roots. Knut Hamsun was first nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1919 for his novel Growth of the Soil. He won the prize the following year, in 1920. With this achievement, he took his place alongside his fellow Norwegian writer Bjørnskjær Bjørnson, who had been awarded the prize in 1903. If in the early days of hunger, Knut Hamsun was a sort of Nietzschean radical with aristocratic overtones in his rhetoric, by the turn of the 20th century he had become more conservative. His growing aversion to democratic institutions, women's emancipation and industrialization led him to embrace Mussolini's fascism and Hitler's Nazism. Hamsun's works enjoyed extraordinary popularity in Nazi Germany. In 1934 alone, 245,000 copies of Growth of the Soil were sold there, alongside hundreds of thousands of his other novels. Even during the Green Year of 1944, special wartime editions of Pan, Victoria and particularly Growth of the Soil were distributed to Wehrmacht soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front. Although fascism remained a marginal force in Norway, with the local National Samling national gathering party failing to win a single seat in the national parliament, Hamsun actively supported its founder, Vidkun Quisling. In the pages of the newspaper Frittfolk, he famously declared, "If I had 10 votes, Quisling would get all of them." In 1935, Hamsun vehemently opposed awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to Karl von Ossietzky, a German journalist and pacifist who had exposed Germany's secret rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. At the time of the nomination, Ossietzky was imprisoned in a Nazi Oldenburg concentration camp where he endured tortures. Hamsun nevertheless denounced him as a traitor who had dishonored his homeland. Endorsing the German occupation of Norway in 1940 caused many to turn their backs on him. In the press, Knut Hamsun blamed the King of Norway and his cabinet for resisting the advancing Germans and urged Norwegian soldiers to surrender. The German authorities appreciated this gesture. On Norwegian territory, the Reich Commissariat was established, with Josef Terboven as its leader. Formerly marginal forces, Norwegian fascists took control of the puppet government. Throughout the occupation period, Knut Hamsun made numerous controversial political statements and published articles in the pro-fascist press. He maintained that Germany was merely protecting Norway from threats posed by what he called insidious Englishmen, Soviets, and later Americans who sought to drag the country into war. In 1943, Hamsun sent his Nobel Prize medal to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. In his response letter, Goebbels described the gift as an expression of your commitment to our fight for a new Europe. Subsequent events included meetings with Goebbels and, more crucially, with Adolf Hitler himself. While Goebbels was an ardent reader of Hamsun's works, Hitler could hardly be called an admirer. There is no evidence that Hitler ever read Hamsun. Nevertheless, the Führer was well aware of the Norwegian writer's value as a propaganda asset. They met at Hitler's Berghof residence in Obersalzberg in June 1943. What were they discussing? According to a transcript of the meeting secretly recorded by Hitler's translator Ernst Edmund Zuchner, Hamsun complained about the harsh measures imposed on Norwegian citizens by Terboven, whom Hamsun wanted removed. Moreover, the writer expressed his concerns about Norway's dependence on Germany, which alienated the majority of his countrymen. Hamsun repeatedly interrupted Hitler. At one point, Hitler abruptly stood up and declared that the meeting was over. Despite his failure to persuade Adolf Hitler, Knut Hamsun displayed no disappointment. He demonstrated remarkable tenacity in maintaining his position. In 1945, he wrote an obituary following Hitler's death, calling him a warrior for humankind and a preacher of gospel of justice for all nations. After the war was over, Hamsun was forced to face justice. He was in a tricky situation. On the one hand, he was the greatest living Norwegian. On the other, he was definitely a traitor. In his final word in court, Hamsun expressed no regret about his behavior during occupation. He stated, "From the first moment of the preliminary hearing held on June 23, I had assumed responsibility for what I had done and have maintained that standpoint unseverely ever since." About his pro-Nazi articles, he said, "It wasn't wrong when I wrote it, it was right, and what I wrote was right." Although Hamsun was medically certified as a person of permanently impaired mental faculties and the accusation against him was dropped, he was sentenced to pay 425,000 kroner. The story of Knut Hamsun is a tricky one. On the one hand, we have a great writer. On the other, a fascist sympathizer. One might isolate one facet of his persona and dismiss the other, or enshrine him in an ivory tower. In 1932, when Hamsun was 73, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset wrote an article titled "In Search of Goethe from Within." The article was devoted to commemorating the centenary of Goethe's death in 1832. In the article, he argues contemporary biography as a method. The average biography is a statue for public square where the author is merely going around. This monumentalism becomes the more obvious the greater the number of anecdotes and details the biographer furnishes us. To escape this attitude, José Ortega y Gasset suggests understanding life as a struggle to attain an authentic self. But what does this mean? For Ortega y Gasset, each person carries a unique vocation, individual program of existence, as he writes. Thus, we can be true to our vocation to a greater or lesser degree, and consequently have a life that is authentic to a greater or lesser degree. Thus, the primary aim of biography becomes determining what the subject's vital vocation was, though it is entirely possible that he was never aware of it. We can discern this vocation relatively easily, since life presents itself as a ruin among whose debris we have to discover what the person ought to have been. In Knut Hamsun's case, we can hardly escape the scenes of an anxious search for vocation or roots. Born into a peasant family, he was never attached to the land. His family had been displaced. As a teenager, he switched jobs frequently, roaming across the country. In his debut work, Hunger, the main character is a man from Norway. We know nothing about him, a modern hero for an age of collapsing identities. This reveals much about how the young Hamsun saw himself, as he wrote to Edvard Brandes, editor of the Danish daily Politiken in 1888. I have deliberately never striven to be Norwegian. I saw somewhere that the greatest poet is held to be he who is most nationalistic, but here I am incapable of understanding. In his 1891 lecture in Oslo, Hamsun fiercely criticized writers. In our collective consciousness, a writer occupies a far greater space than he merits. We inflate his significance until he becomes a monument detached from the flesh and blood human who once held the pen. But eventually, he found his roots, or so it seemed to him, being a Norwegian writer. Yet even in his late works, this uncertainty about vocation resurfaces. Consider Eliseus in Growth of the Soil, a son of Isaac who leaves for the city to work as a clerk, who returns to take over a failed trading post, who lasts impossibly after an already attached woman, and who, in the end, immigrated to America, never to return. But, as Franz Kafka aptly observes in his diary of 1919, Eliseus could have become the hero of the book, and in Hamsun's youth such would probably have been the case. Knut Hamsun fell victim to his own success. The greater his acclaim, the more isolated he became. As José Ortega y Gasset writes in his article, "If the world fulfilling our desires with magic docility, our self will fall voluptuously asleep. Instead of being revealed to itself, it remains vague."